This video is part of a series called COVID-19 Business Actions. I'm joined again by Todd Want, Director of Tax. And Todd, you're here to give us an update on the JobKeeper payment measures.
I am, that's right.
Now Todd, I understand that it passed through Parliament.
That's right, the measures have now passed through Parliament, but in a slightly unusual form. Normally the legislation that covers these type of measures has a lot of detail behind it. Instead, these measures basically set out a framework for how the JobKeeper payment might work, but handed the Treasurer huge powers to actually implement it and provide the detail behind the measures.
Now, my understanding is that this measure is expected to cost in the region of about $130 billion. Does that mean that the Treasurer has effectively been written a blank cheque?
Well, theoretically, I guess you could say yes, but practically no. Why they've done it this way is to give the Treasurer the ability to be nimble, to make decisions along the way. They've given him a framework to work within, but given how quickly this coronavirus issue has evolved over recent weeks, rather than having to recall Parliament on a regular basis to make little tweaks here and there, they've just given him the powers to move on with this.
Now, as discussed previously, the eligibility requirements are quite complex, but in essence, you have to have shown a significant loss in revenue. In reading through the documentation, I understand you've grouped clients, businesses, into three distinct groups.
Yeah, well, I think that basically there's three groups. One is those that won't qualify. So some businesses, and take supermarkets as an example, their turnover is in fact up at the moment. So those are just not going to qualify. Then you've got a second category there, which is the ones that clearly will qualify. Those whose businesses have more or less completely had a downturn. Their revenue may be down 80, 90, 100%. For those businesses, I think there's probably two or three key things. One is there's a fair bit of admin that will be involved in qualifying for these measures on the regular basis to get the payments as they come through. But cash flow, because these measures require that you have already paid wages to your staff, and then this measure will allow you to get effectively a reimbursement at the following month. Cash flow will actually be hugely important for those businesses. So even though they've clearly qualified, cash flow, will they actually have the cash to do this? And the third category of businesses, I think, are those that are the borderline ones. Their revenue might be lumpy, or they just don't know whether their revenue has declined or will decline by enough to qualify for these measures. For those businesses, get on top of your numbers. You really need to be on top of your numbers to understand how this measure might impact you. And why I say that, a lot of the key parts of this measure is based on what your forecast revenue will look like for the coming month or quarter. So if you don't know your numbers with sufficient rigor, then you could actually expose yourself to penalties, interest, and having to repay the amount that you've received under this, because there's some pretty strict integrity measures. And the burden of proof will be on you to make sure that your forecasts are robust enough and defendable.
So a lot there. So people should be forecasting frequently, so weekly, monthly, fortnightly.
Absolutely, yeah. Get on top of your numbers.
Now, one of the most hotly contested issues in the last week has been whether sole traders, partnerships, self-employed, those type of people, would they be eligible for this measure? Has that been dealt with?
Self-employed people will be able to qualify, but they will have an extra layer of proof within these measures, and that is to prove, particularly if they're running their business through a partnership or a trust, or they're a director of a company and they don't actually take a proper wage, that they're actively involved in a genuine business, and their involvement isn't just contrived to try and get themselves these payments.
Now, my understanding, Todd, is that this is not just a tax issue, but it does have other implications for businesses.
Yeah, definitely. So part of the bills that passed Parliament also impacted the Fair Work Act. Now, the Fair Work Act is part of the legal framework as to how people employ staff and certain requirements that are around that. So the adjustments that were needed to that to allow for these measures, people need to understand legally what they can do with their staff. Can they stand them down? How does that work? How these payments will operate, and the various awards they're under. So that's one aspect. I think also people shouldn't forget that at the moment, payroll tax, workers' compensation, will these payments be included, excluded from those? We still need to wait and see how that fits in.
Are there any other complexities that people need to be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of these measures will depend on the size of the business or the group that they're involved in. So if you've got a foreign parent company or there's multiple companies in a group, that could potentially impact on your eligibility towards these measures. But also I think there's some unanswered questions around things like service entities, where your staff are employed in one entity in the group, but the actual trading activities are in another entity in the group. Some of those aspects haven't fully been fleshed out at this point in time.
So clearly there's a lot of detail to come and we're still awaiting some guidance. But what can businesses be doing now?
Okay, so businesses should be in part waiting for further guidance from the ATO, but we shouldn't just be waiting. One thing that businesses need to be doing is getting on top of their lodgements, making sure they're all up to date with their activity statements, tax returns, those type of documents. Also on top of their numbers, the forecasting and budgeting, making sure that they're able to pull together those numbers because they will be needed for a lot of businesses. And then their cash flow, understanding have they got the money to actually be able to implement these measures. The timing difference between when you're actually paying the staff and when you're receiving the reimbursement. Can you actually hold out for that? And some businesses won't be able to. So really understanding and appreciating that I think is really quite important.
So a much appreciated measure, but a lot of complexity for people to deal with.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time today, Todd. If you've got any other issues you'd like us to cover, drop us a little message. Otherwise, head to our COVID-19 resource page at williambuck.com.